Hello and welcome to Foreign Correspondents, where we seek to delve into issues of interest here in Korea. I'm Min San-hee, and joining me on set are the foreign journalists who will be sharing their views with us on today's topic. It's good to have you all back.
Good to be here.
Good to be back.
And how did you spend your week?
I worked on 4 different things. There was a documentary film festival called DMZ Docs that I covered, and a couple of interesting films there for Iran in terms of the occupation of Palestine by Israel. Also did a story about Park Geun-hye's speech on Armed Forces Day, and Minister of Science, Research and Technology coming to Seoul to implement 60 memorandums of understanding that Park Geun-hye signed with Iran back in May. So those are the stories I covered this week.
I'm responsible for both Koreas as well as Japan, and so I went to Yokohama, which is where the cup noodle museum is. Cup noodle, the famous invention by a Taiwanese-born Japanese man. And September was the 45th anniversary of this invention, and it was lovely. It was really fun to visit.
This week I did a story about Danish adoptees. So people who were adopted from Korea and spent all their lives in Denmark, and now they're coming back to look for their parents, their Korean parents. So it was a very interesting story to do. I spent some time with some Danes who were looking, having DNA tests and looking around for their parents. So very emotional, very interesting story to do.
The law was named after Kim Yong-ran, the former head of Korea's Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission, who first introduced the bill. The law is officially known as the Improper Solicitation and Graft Act. As the name suggests, it's designed to stem bribery and solicitation of government officials in order to enhance people's trust in public agencies. Under this legislation, public officials, journalists, private school teachers, as well as their spouses are liable to criminal charges if they accept any financial gifts or other advantages in excess of 1 million won, about $900 in one sitting. But in respect of existing cultural practices, meals of up to 30,000 won, gifts of up to 50,000 won, and monetary gifts for weddings and funerals of a maximum 100,000 won can be exchanged.
법의 구체적 내용을 사례 중심으로 국민들과 적용 대상자들에게 정확히 알려서 시행 초기 혼란이 생기지 않도록 챙겨 주시기를 바랍니다.
With the implementation of the Kim Yong-ran Act, Korea is already seeing a number of changes, both big and small. Some restaurants have altered their meals and price ranges to ensure they do not exceed the price cap of 30,000 won per person. Flower shops have also been hit hard by the anti-graft law, with demand for floral wreaths and gifts sliding. Tickets for concerts and other performances are also categorized as bribes if their price exceeds 50,000 won, causing a lot of companies to lower their prices below the threshold. An estimated 4 million people are said to fall directly under the scope of the Kim Yong-ran Act, but with its extensive reach, the new law is expected to have lasting effects in all areas of Korean society.
The Kim Yong-ran law took effect late last month. It was, and still is, a topic of debate here in the media as the country seeks to root out corruption. What are your thoughts on the law?
I think it's a great idea that South Korea addresses the issue of corruption in society, and the passage of this law is a step in the right direction in terms of understanding that this is a problem. However, I don't think the law goes far enough, first off, and second off, I don't think it's up to the courts and prosecutors and the police to to change this type of behavior. I think there needs to be a shift in South Koreans' understanding of what is good, acceptable behavior in terms of the relationship between people that you do business with and government officials, the media, and educators.
I think that's a really good point that he brings up, actually, that this is actually seeking to use a legal system to try and change culture, which can be effective but can also be quite punitive on places that don't necessarily see the types of corruption that what we understand that Korean society is so upset about, right? Korean society, from what we understand, is very fed up with conglomerates, with chaebol, the sort of top-level culture, a revolving door, if you will, between government and the top 5 companies in this country. This law, which sort of caps meals and caps holiday gifts, doesn't address those sorts of top-level issues. And so I think it's worth further interrogating it.
I think it's a very, very interesting initiative, and it's going to be interesting following how it's going to be received. Is this going to work in the short run and in the longer run? And it's definitely positive that something is being done about the issues with graft and corruption that's obviously there in the Korean society and need to be dealt with. So it's going to be a very, very interesting law to follow as a correspondent here in Korea.
Right. Prior to its implementation, the law had been upheld by the Constitutional Court earlier in July following petitions claiming that the law was unconstitutional. What were your thoughts once you learned that the law had been upheld by the Constitutional Court earlier in July and that it had in fact been put into practice in September 28th?
Well, I wasn't surprised that it was put into practice in a legal sense, but whether it will be put into practice in a practical sense or implemented and utilized by prosecutors and officials and people will be prosecuted for offenses regarding this law, I think is another matter. There are lots of laws in South Korea, including traffic laws and red lights, that are not observed in society. And I think this, the Kim Young-ran law, is one of those laws that will be on the books, but whether it will be observed in society or put into practice and enforced by the government, by prosecutors and the police, I think is another issue altogether, and we'll have to sort of wait and see.
This is an attempt to try to change something that's so deep-rooted in Korean culture, trying to change the business culture of the country. And you've had attempts of trying to do similar things before where it just didn't work. The government made a law saying that the hagwons, the private academies, had to close at 10 p.m. And the parents just found a way around that, They met at cafes after 10 p.m. and the private studying just kept on. Regardless of that new law. And I thought initially, something similar would happen here with this anti-graft law, that people would find a way around it somehow.
I see. So we'll still have to wait and see how the law unfolds. There are similar anti-corruption efforts around the world. In China, for instance, one could face a death penalty simply for accepting a bribe. Tell us a little bit about the anti-corruption efforts or campaigns in your country, Denmark, Marcus.
Well, we have quite a few transparency measures in Denmark in place. So, for example, if you're a private company and you donate gifts to public officials, then those gifts are made publicly available. So if you're a reporter in Denmark, you can access lists where you can see, so these are the gifts that the royal family in Denmark were giving over the past year. These are the gifts that the Ministry of Finance were given from outside donors. And you can cross-check and you can see if there's something going on there that shouldn't be going on. And then, of course, the people involved risk ending up on the front page of the Danish tabloid newspapers. Nobody wants to do that. So there are transparency measures. And also, we, as a rule, public officials aren't allowed to receive any gifts. There are exceptions to that rule, but that is a rule that is in place.
I see. How about the U.S.?
Well, it's the same way. So the way that laws are typically written to combat corruption or the appearance of corruption or this notion of quid pro quo is always with transparency. So there's a lot of laws on the books about accountability, about how campaigns have to report campaign finance. So every dollar that comes into a campaign, where it comes from, this is all searchable and public now. Also, there are caps on lobbyists. So in the US, obviously, special interests have a lot of power. And so we're talking pharmaceutical groups, oil and gas, big business in general. So these industry groups will tend to try and curry favor with lawmakers. In order to do so, there are things like this notion of meals or parties or things like that. And there is a lobbying cap on not only meals, but also gifts. And then also there's lobbying disclosure acts too. And so at the state level, at the municipal level, and at the federal level, there's a lot of rules about how much a lobbyist can give to a campaign. Again, just like in Denmark, nobody gives money personally to somebody's family or anything. This is always sort of to the campaign or to the lawmaker's sort of charity or some sort of account. And so all of those things are required by law to be disclosed.
I see. Popular in Korea is the culture of having one diner foot the bill instead of splitting the bill or going Dutch. Also common is the practice of gift giving when invited to a person's house, which is precisely why there are concerns that this particular law stands in conflict with the Korean tradition of socializing, if you will. Frank, how do you see this law as affecting the Korean culture of wining and dining?
Well, I think I've already read that it has had an effect on restaurants and places like golf courses and on florists and things like that. But I think that we need to separate lunches that have a business conflict to just lunch with a friend. And this law won't affect individuals taking out friends for lunch. So the most of the behavior, certainly of gift giving and taking out other people for lunch, I hope won't be affected. And that's a part of Korean culture that, I think we can embrace. I often get annoyed at foreigners being so cheap that they all go and line up at the cash register when there's 3 of them and they're going to have lunch together the next day anyway or the day after that, and the other guys can pay back, but they all go 1-1-1 just because they don't want to pay for that person's large fries instead of regular fries. I think that's kind of petty. And I really admire South Koreans' generosity that they displayed towards their friends and relatives on occasions like that.
I see. Is an extravagant meal considered a bribe in Denmark?
Yes, it is. An expensive meal would be considered a bribe, but there's no law saying how expensive that meal would have to be. But there's sort of a common consensus that any meal over that would cost more than 1,000 kroner, which is about 150,000 won or 150 US dollars.
Per person or per group?
No, that's per person. That's per person. So one reason is restaurants are pretty expensive in Denmark, but that's per person. So it's permitted to have a work lunch or a work dinner, and also a pretty expensive one. But if it's more than 150,000 won, then you might get in trouble. Yeah. But that happens pretty regularly still in Denmark and in Scandinavia, that public officials do accept too lavish gifts. We've had quite a few incidents of politicians going on expensive hunting trips abroad. So they'd be invited by private companies to go on hunting trips, which is also, could be problematic.
I see. I suppose it's too early to discuss the measures necessary to ensure the successful implementation of this law, but if we were to discuss such measures, what do you see as being necessary?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. We're going to have to watch over the 6-9 months or a year to see who is getting caught by this, right? Because from what I understand, this law is written vaguely enough such that if I see 2 people having lunch together and one is a government official and the other is somebody from a company, I could report you without that much evidence, and then you 2 could get in trouble, right? So so I'd be interested to see if it's a bunch of public servants that are sort of workaday people at the low level and a bunch of teachers of 3rd graders that are getting snagged by this, or whether it catches actually what we consider big fish, people who are actually trying to influence policy in a substantial way.
Right. In essence, the Improper Solicitation and Graft Act seeks to secure a transparent society, one where corruption is effectively confronted. The law also, however, underscores the challenge, as one report points out, in changing a culture where the lines between goodwill gestures and bribery can be blurred. The Kim Young-nan law also targets journalists, and there is debate over the necessity of including these members of the media in the law. Up next is a video with details.
The Kim Young-nan Act was designed to encourage civil servants to place greater emphasis on fairness and equality in their day-to-day duties to win over trust from the public. But the new law includes journalists as well, reflecting the strong will of former Anti-Corruption Commission head Kim Young-nan.
특히 공공성이 강한 분야의 확대를 시도한 것이어서 평등권의 문을 침해한 문제라고 생각을 하지 않습니다.
In July, the Constitutional Court ruled in favor of the Anti-Graft Act, saying journalists and private school teachers require just as much transparency in their work as civil servants.
법의 내용에 보면 부정 청탁을 금지한다는 내용, 그리고 금품을 이유 없이 수수하는 것을 막는 내용, 이런 부분들이 규정이 되어 있습니다. 그 어디에도 언론의 자유를 침해한다든지 또는 사학의 자유를 침해한다는 그런 규정은 없습니다.
But some argue that subjecting journalists to the anti-graft law might be overstepping the bounds.
민간 부분까지 그 대상을 확대할 경우 당초 그 김영란법의 취지에도 맞지 않을 뿐만 아니라
Will the anti-corruption Kim Young-nan law enhance transparency within Korean media, or might it infringe press freedom? We sit down now for more.
So, is it right to include journalists in this law?
Well, I think that, trying to stamp out corruption in journalism through this free lunch system is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of our sort of vocation. I think that there's an inherent conflict in journalism in terms of the sponsorship of news media, whether that be commercial sponsorship, state sponsorship, or even subscribers. We're writing and producing news reports for our audience and our sponsors. In one aspect, and the idea of that value-neutral journalism is something that we aspire to, but that is sometimes can be difficult to put into practice. And I know that in South Korea it's a little bit different in terms of the, scope of this sort of free lunch system that goes on at perhaps some of the ministries and areas where there's many journalists covering affairs. But the inherent conflict in journalism will always still be there.
I think it would be much more constructive if the media themselves enforced similar laws. So if the media, I'm sure a lot of Korean media already have ethical guidelines, but if they really ensured that their reporters abided by those guidelines, and if they were facing serious consequences if they did not. For example, if you're a media, you could have a set of guidelines saying you can't accept gifts that are more expensive than 100,000 won or so. And if your reporters do anyway, then they would be in deep trouble.
There are claims that the law will come at a price, an economic price, to be precise. Frank, what are your thoughts on this?
I feel pretty strongly about this. Everything that I've read in the South Korean media so far has said the cost that this will bear. And one figure that was floated out there was more than $10 billion. I think that's the wrong argument altogether. The Koreans need to understand the cost of not implementing a law like this and enabling this type of behavior, the cost that has in terms of the social welfare and economic growth and economic benefits that having a fair and transparent society provide. So something like that seems, let's say lavishing one student more attention than other students in your class because you're a teacher receiving some gifts from one parent, that has a social and future economic cost. Just like a government official approving one work permit or one business permit ahead of another, not based on merit. This type of behavior has a social and economic cost that could be investigated and would be, I think, exponentially larger than the cost of implementing this law. Although I do feel for those people in the lower levels, I don't have a lot of sympathy for the large hotels that charge more than $50 or $100 for buffet lunches for bigwigs, but I do feel bad for, let's say, florists and small business people, caddies at golf courses, and restaurant owners and restaurant workers that will suffer, possibly suffer from this law and this shift in behavior. And I hope that the South Korean government maybe creates, work sort of re-education programs for those people.
Now, as journalists here in Korea, we've been focusing on the receiving end of the deal. My question to you is, have you been on the giving end of the bargain? For instance, have you been obliged to buy a meal or perhaps buy presents in the course of covering a particular story?
I routinely take people out for coffee and sometimes for lunch, but my standard is to bring pastry when I go to interview a source, because I'm taking up their time. If I'm often interview talking heads, the media I work for, they really like to have talking heads. Those people are very busy. For me to go to a professor's office and take a half an hour of his time without a week in advance, like I call them in the morning and say, can you fit me in the afternoon? And so I am inconveniencing that person, to say the least. So their, generosity with their time to spend with me to give me an interview is something that I value and require, and it should be compensated on some level, but I can't afford to pay them what they're actually probably worth for that half an hour, but I can, bring them a small token of my appreciation, and I try to do that as much as possible.
Right. It has been less than 2 weeks since the Improper Solicitation Graft Act has been put into practice, and pundits say there will be much trial and error before the law secures a firm foothold in the society. Also, despite the presence of debate, there is consensus, however, with hopes that the law will usher in a fresh era of transparency. Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Foreign Correspondents. How do you assess today's discussion, Frank?
I think it's great that this debate is taking place in South Korean society. It's really important. While we complain about corruption in South Korean society, and there is it is a serious problem, this is a debate that's taking place. The pages of newspapers and media are full of these types of stories, and shedding a light on this issue is part of the solution to creating what we all seek here, which is a cleaner, fairer society.
I think what Frank said at the outset about cultural and institutional change being really the core of affecting sort of behavior and curbing corruption being very important. So outside of the law, I think there needs to be sort of an examination of what's okay and what's not okay for society. And the second is, I think, time will tell whether this particular measure, this particular legislation is the right legislation. In the US, there's a slew. There's just pages and pages and pages of anti-corruption or laws that are meant to curb corruption. And so one sort of sweeping law doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It is actually kind of a buffet of various ways to sort of call for transparency, create penalties for behavior that is seen as unsavory.
Right. Marcus, a few last words.
Well, I agree completely. I think this law could be a step in the right direction. I still think Korea needs to address corruption taking place at the upper levels of society, and that's very important that they start doing that as well.
Right, and we'll keep our fingers crossed and wait and see how the law unfolds. Autumn is a season of many associations here in Korea, including that of harvest, melancholy, books, and more. In the autumn of 2016, we hope that you will associate this season with the many positive issues we hope to bring your way. Thank you for watching.